Ubisoft is done a thing that is a Ubisoft thing, which is really shit. Um, so
They're breaking the mold.
breaking them on more like they've just copied the latest cool idea. So AI, everybody's into AI at the moment. It's this big, exciting thing that people can't shut up about as of the last 12 months. ChatGPT for writing, Stable Diffusion for visual arts, and the video game industry, because there isn't a bad idea that the video game industry hasn't latched onto in its entirety, has decided that this stuff is going to be highly applicable to the work they do. And Ubisoft is leading the way, of course, just like they did with NFTs, which worked out really well for them. And they have announced, or they've got this tool called Ghostwriter, not Rider, Writer, which is going to, which is an AI tool that they're going to use to write NPC dialogue, which will be used for generating text for the simplest, most repetitive part of video game scripts, which in Ubisoft's case is about 99% of their scripts. And that's what we're going to talk about in this section of the podcast. AI tools and their application to gaming. It's not just Ubisoft, I must be fair. Everybody else is talking about it as well. I actually saw the developers behind Mountain Blade, which I can't remember the name of the developer right now, which is pretty stupid of me. I should have researched that.
Banner Studios or something like that, isn't it?
Yeah. So they about I want to say 6 weeks to 2 months ago, they put out a tweet talking about how they've created an AI tool which will allow them to create unlimited dialogue within their games. That you'll go up to an NPC and you'll talk to the NPC, and the NPC will just generate text on the fly based on the AI inputs and stuff. They present this as a great thing, but having used AI stuff myself, I would suggest that it's not a great thing at all. And it's actually pretty terrible. And while it might be good for creating unlimited content, there is something to be said about having a bit of curation in there and actually having an artist look over it and have some creative ideas about text. And yeah, so it's also they're also looking very much at how they can use tools like Stable Diffusion to do visual assets. And there was a tweet last week by Mr. Dylan Cuthbert, who is a very good game developer, and I certainly have a lot of respect for him. But he is quite in love with AI art, and he put out a tweet on the new version of Midjourney. That's the name of the tool, isn't it? Midjourney. He used the new version of Midjourney to create these kimono wearing characters, and he was very much in love with the results that it got. But an actual kimono expert then did a pretty lengthy tweet thread about all the mistakes that Midjourney had made, which actually made those art pieces look a little bit insensitive. And Dylan was eventually forced to delete that tweet. So yeah, we thought talk about the implications of all these AI tools in video games and whether they're going to be additive to the game development process or perhaps not so. Um, yeah, Harvard. We'll start with you. Um, what are your thoughts,
I'm kind
just
of
in a
mixed
general
because
sense?
I feel like this has already existed in games for quite a while, right? We just haven't talked about it in this same conversation because suddenly it's leaked out into writing and art. But before, like procedurally generated levels or like procedurally generated everything was a thing, right? I'm sure there's games out there that have the Mountain Blade dialogue system where the dialogue itself like is generated from a bunch of different prompts. And even the Ubisoft thing that I was looking at, it seems like a similar thing. Like it's not ChatGPT making something brand new. It's going from a bank of different possible responses and
Well,
generating some stuff based on that.
I mean, that really is all ChatGPT is. It's just a very, very large bank of
Yeah, a much
text.
larger pool of doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge database, and I mean, AI is not intelligent, which is a bit of a misnomer. But really, all AI is just a learning model. And what people
Yeah.
do is they feed a lot of data, and I'm talking about a lot of
Oh, from
data.
Twitter.
a lot of data
A
into
lot of
this,
stuff.
yeah, into these things, and then they use it to train it so that it recognizes when you put an input in. Say, for example, you say, I want a girl wearing a kimono, then it looks through that massive database that it has to find all the kimono photos it has, and then pulls out kind of points of commonality. And from those points of commonality, it then generates an image that is kind of an aggregate of all that information that it has. That's really how AI works.
Hmm.
And you are right, I guess, in the sense that we we've had in video games the games generating stuff on the fly for a long time. The roguelikes, like
Yeah.
you mentioned, are a really good example of that. Procedural generation is a really good example of that. But for me, I mean, I don't know. I must admit, I do have concerns about this stuff becoming too prominent, that developers start to rely on it, because it's one thing to have a roguelike generate the level that you're wandering around on the fly, and that can be good or bad. It can be quite lazy, but developers that do it well, like the Shiren games or whatever, um, get away with it. But it's another level entirely to have your game kind of rely on it for dialogue and for art, like the stuff that you like
Yeah.
see.
It's stuff that should be created by humans,
Yeah,
realistically.
yeah, yeah.
If we take art as an example, though, would you argue that, for example, No Man's Sky graphically is an AI generated game? Because all the creatures, all the plants, all the planets and biomes and stuff, all of that is made by an algorithm. So that's, I mean, it's humans deciding what the parameters are, and then the actual planets themselves are randomly generated.
It's a good example.
It's actually a really good question because I don't know.
It's a question of where the line is, isn't it? It's like, and
Yeah.
whether it it can be applied to a broader range of things. Like No Man's Sky, yes, it will procedurally, and I'm not sure if I would define a difference between procedural generation and AI. There, I get the sense, without having thought about it too deeply, I get the sense that there is a line there somewhere. But let's assume that the line is fluid, and effectively what you're talking about, like No Man's Sky, is AI generated. But even if it is, then No Man's Sky was not exactly a narrative driven experience. If
Yeah, yeah. I
like
mean, I think if there's a line, the far end of that line would be far out end would be the outer world, or no, the outer wilds, right? The one where you planet hop, and every single planet has been carefully put there for a narrative purpose.
Yeah, because if you're creating things that if you're using AI, then you do cede some control of what you've got to the algorithms. Uh, it could be level design, which is effectively what No Man's Sky and roguelikes do. They cede control of the level design to the AI, and they just kind of hope that the AI is going to create something that's compelling. They will often limit it as a result to a certain number of possible outcomes, in order to make sure that it doesn't break and ruin the experience of the player. But they still do cede parts of the experience to it. And when you get to the point where you start to cede control over how characters look, or how the story is written, then I'm not sure we're going to enjoy the results. um,
I mean, the worst parts of No Man's Sky were talking to those dudes, and it was always just randomly generated nonsense. Like I hated that. It was
yes,
complete, just gumph.
yes, and that's really kind of what it's going to be like for Ubisoft's games, or
Imagine
Mount and
Ubisoft
Blade
leading out
3.
to do Assassin's Creed or something like that, completely driven on like a procedurally generated like level and like graphics and dialogue and stuff like that. You just like can't do it
Well,
in that sort of type of game.
a really good example would be if Ubisoft, and let's face it, Ubisoft is going to do it because Ubisoft is going to do Ubisoft. But if Ubisoft was to use AI algorithms to generate its characters in its next historical game. It's doing one in Japan, right? Let's use that as a good example. In its next game, if it was to use AI to generate the character costumes for random people that you're kind of walking past on the street, the fact that AI gets this stuff wrong constantly means that it's going to undermine the one thing that the Assassin's Creed games did pretty well, which was the historical context, right?
Isn't that the exactly what Watch Dogs Legion was? Was it just randomly generates a whole city of characters and you can play as any of them?
Did it do that randomly?
Yeah, so
And
Watch
we have to
Dogs had
we do have to be careful about differentiating, I guess, random and this I did mention it earlier that there is a line between it. There is a difference between randomly generated and not procedurally and AI generated because um the the thought process, no, not the thought process, the algorithms behind AI are much more complex, and what it can do is a lot more complex. With procedural generation or with randomly generated, you're basically, putting all the data into the game already, and it just kind of picks it out at random. But from set parameters, the idea of AI is that it's much broader and um, it can do it from outside of what's already kind of in the system as such. So they are different things.
Yeah, Watch Dogs was definitely procedural. I vaguely remember them being all like, "This is all like a procedurally
You can play
generated
as a
world."
granny.
Yeah, and it like, yeah, it has like all that sort of stuff like in like a database, and it just says, okay, well, this granny's gonna spawn here, and then it's gonna have like it might have like the what's time for weird, annoying power ups, which like would be hilarious for a granny to have, and that's the whole point of their trailer, which they put out. Like, so there was some sort of like curation to it, but there was also all the stuff and information was there. It wasn't AI saying, okay, well, the granny has like a big nose, looks like Pinocchio, and has like fluffy hair, is pink, and runs around screaming like "Hi Kayamba." Like that wasn't what was happening in Watch Dogs.
It
Yeah, my hot
seems
take is that those were just the human versions of getting a Diablo weapon. Like it's the same thing as a loot game. Instead of it being loot, it's a person.
Yes.
So it's kind of more procedural than it is AI in that regard.
Yes. And I
And same
mean
with
the
Borderlands as well.
the difference is that procedural generation once again is based on parameters that have already been built into the game, whereas AI is meant to be something a bit more open than
Expansive.
that. Yeah, and it's more about creating something on the fly. So, AI would AI character generator would not necessarily it would work without necessarily already having that character in the system in some way already. Um, so it is an
The Blue
it
Boo
is
shows up in the new
it is
in the new
it is
Ubisoft game
another
set in
stage.
Cuba.
It is another stage. I guess the point is that with procedural generation, for example, Watch Dogs and what they did before, the developers already knew that that stuff was already in the game in some on some level. Whereas with AI, they don't know what is already in the game. They
I mean,
can
it
they
becomes like a philosophical question then, right? It's the difference between a person curating what goes into the algorithm versus a person curating what doesn't go in from the algorithm.
yeah, but you can't curate what goes in as such with AI beyond limiting the data that you put into it or training the model in a certain way that it will likely create an outcome based on inputs that the player or whoever puts into it. It's very hard to the developer has no way at all of knowing exactly what's going to result from a person interacting with an AI in their game.
Are we talking about using AI tools to put content into a game, like put graphics or dialogue into a game?
Well,
Or are we
that's
talking about
really
like
how
a
that's really what the games industry seems to be driving towards. There seems to
hmm,
be this effort, firstly, to use ChatGPT or novel AI or whatever kind of text-driven thing
I
to
think to
create
cut
the
down costs,
dialogue as you
basically.
play, and means it's a cost-cutting thing, right? Because these tools are effectively free. So
Oh, but
rather than
I think
hiring a
this.
writer to write a spreadsheet with 1,000 lines of different dialogue that they'll then go and drop into the game, and in whatever point, they'll just say, oh, AI is now going to generate the text for all these NPC characters. And it's the same with the art. Rather than having the artist create things, pay the artist to do so, they'll just say the AI produces. So at the moment, in terms of visuals, they're only using AI for simple things like the stuff that they would outsource to content factories in China or whatever, like grass and textures for walls or whatever. But there will be a point where some developer will say, "Hey, look, we're going to use it to create our characters," and it'll start with minor characters. But who knows if they'll end up, just getting rid of their most of their art department and just having the AI generate all the major characters as well. Um, and I guess the concern I have with all of this stuff is this stuff will be uh, something that the indies would experiment with more, at least especially at the start, because indies already have very limited resources, and this becomes a very easy solution to them. In the same way that roguelikes were a solution to a lot of indies to having somebody design levels, and it allowed them to create a game that was 40 hours long, even though they didn't have the capacity to design 40 hours worth of levels. So that's fundamentally the reason that you have so many roguelikes that's in the indie space. Uh, Indies will start to look at AI as solutions to text, to visuals, and all the rest of it. And indies are the one space that we have where there's still some kind of artistic credibility in terms of the ideas behind games. So I'm not comfortable with this idea that AI is going to have this big impact because, yeah, it doesn't seem to me to work well with the idea of art. That art is essentially human ideas that are kind of executed into whatever medium that the artist is working in. So whether it's film or literature or whatever, it is a human expressing themselves in some way. That's fundamentally what art is. And this AI thing is really kind of messing with that, I think.
Sounds like good Far Cry
But
6
robots need to express
expression.
themselves.
That's how you get near Automata.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna have a thirsty boy robot destroy the world to give a kissy.
I'm kind of two
That's the
thoughts of
plan.
that, Matt, because I think let's have two hypothetical indie games, right? Let's have the indie game where the narrative and writing is why the developers made the indie game. Something like Celeste, if you want to take a gameplay example, or something like Coffee Talk, if you want to take a dialogue example, right? That's a person who really wanted to write that story, and that I think will continue existing forever. But if we just want to take a indie game that's mostly mechanics driven, something like, I mean, I find it hard to even think of an example, but something like Super Meat Boy, right, where the actual writing or the actual dialogue doesn't matter, or even like a Chemco game, right? A game where it's just a JRPG mechanics and the characters
Oh
don't matter, the
my
dialogue doesn't matter.
God.
If you
Chemco.
don't really care about it, then does it really matter
Oh,
if it was made by a human?
you just Chemco's going to make so many more RPGs.
But like, why does it doesn't really matter, right? We
They're
know
going to
that,
make so many more games with AI. They're just going to produce one every week. Oh
and
my
then we can continue
God.
not playing them, and we don't have to care.
Harvard, you've given me the worst nightmare of my life.
You know when it's going to really take off? Once it hits Unity. So like developers have been smart enough that like it's got NFTs are all through Unity and they're not really using it. But once all of this AI stuff hits Unity or like some other like development platform, it's like we've now got all these cool AI tools. That's when it's going to take off. You know that, right?
It is,
I
but
mean,
I
in
think
all
there's
honesty, I
always going
prefer
to be
AI.
real writing.
Yeah.
You have a very positive outlook there, Harvard, that I don't think I don't think the industry will necessarily follow along with, to be honest. Um, the
I
reality
think there's
is,
some use to these
and
sort of
we've
tools, like the Ubisoft one, for example. Like at the moment, yes, it looks like some sort of fun assist tool, which they'd be able to say, okay, well, this dialogue is generated, but I don't really want that. Let's put it in. But it's really training the algorithm, which eventually those people are going to be replaced. That's the long and short of it. That eventually, as this algorithm gets better, it's going to not need human intervention to do that sort of stuff to verify it as much for those sort of small dialogues. And then it gets to the point where, okay, well, let's try and write a more bigger, grander story with it. It will slowly get more and more rooted into the industry. Both dialogue and image platforms, which is why Matt's, or doom and gloom, everything's going to be horrible, because that's where the industry mainly leads to. It just infects. Once it's in something, it's going to infect every aspect of development.
no the
Easier way
the
to make money will always be the way that they'll go.
yeah the problem with AI is that it isn't creative. That's the thing. That is the fundamental problem with using AI for anything that is remotely related. And it could be something as minor as some NPC character that you run into once in over the course of the game. It could be the two-sentence introduction to a Super Meat Boy style game. It could be something as simple as that. But whatever amount of work that you give to the AI is going to be work that is not creative within your creative project. All AI can do is aggregate information. That is all it does. It just runs a search basically through its entire database and spits out the result that is most like what the algorithm has been trained to think is the answer to whatever problem's been put to it. All AI can do is use information that it already has access to repurpose it in a way, in a way that is contextual to its situation. What I'm saying is it can't create anything new. All it can do is just present what is already there. So the the fundamental idea of art is to create something new. That can be creating something new based on something that's already existed. It could be a homage, it could be a parody, it could be a satire, it could be there are any number of ways that you can repurpose ideas that are already out there, but it is a new application of that idea that you're working with, which is not what AI does. All AI does is just keep repackaging what is already there. What it's going to result in is this homogenization effect where every game is going to have dialogue which is effectively exactly the same as every other game that you've already played. Um, every game is going to have a scenario which is effectively the same as every other game you've ever played. Every game is going to have characters that look the same as every other game that you've ever played, because that is all AI is ever going to be able to do. And I know that that is what the AAA industry already wants, because it's already trying to make every game like every other game you've already played in your life. But that's
That,
not good
that
for the art world.
if you
That
think about it
And I
though,
think,
like sorry, Alan,
yeah, go for it.
a good proportion of AAA development from the last 20 or so years has just been that anyway, right?
yeah,
Like, how
which is
can we make what's already been there?
how many AAA games do I play in a year because of that reason?
But that's the
I've
thing, right?
been
Like,
I've been bitching about this stuff for decades. It's just a new it's a new way for the AAA developers to accelerate this homogenization that they've been working at. They're just going to every game is going to be this big open world where every character talks exactly the same way because it's just AI driven, and everybody looks exactly the same because they're AI driven. And yeah, it's just you'll spend your entire life playing them because they'll be endless. The good thing I guess about AI is you can effectively make an endless game without having to have somebody write endless amounts of content. But who really wants that? I
that's already the problem we have, right? We already have characters that look the same and narratives that are the same and unambitious um AAA games, and we just don't play them, and it's fine, right? We go and seek out things that are interesting,
well,
and if
we do, but the general game playing audience is not. Um, I don't know. I just see this as yet another stage in the declining creative and artistic credibility of 90% of the games industry. That's for me, that's what all of this stuff represents.
A
Yeah.
scary rise of content.
A lot of people are out there talking about how will AI make a whole bunch of jobs redundant? Will writers not have a job anymore? Will artists not have a job? I'm not necessarily concerned about that, in a sense that I think that writers and artists will be able to find work in spaces outside of AI anyway. But what I am concerned about is what it means to the creative credibility of the games that are being made. And that was already on a downward spiral, as you said, Harvard, but this is going to accelerate things further, I think.
So to do a bit of a contrasting point to you, there's a video game that came out called Hylix. And I don't know if you've seen Hylix before, but it's a claymation JRPG sort of game. And all the dialogue is randomly generated by a computer. And because of that, it has the most surreal, insane atmosphere that it kind of works to its advantage. Like the way that it works is so uncomfortable that it meshes completely perfectly with the creepy and odd looking claymation figures. So I think there's potential for things, if used appropriately and in the correct format, to create a vibe. I think that's cool. But I'm not sure about it being used in most other situations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not against randomization or procedural generation. I'm fine with roguelikes. There's plenty of roguelikes I like. The idea of that game that you're talking about there, Alan, it sounds good to me. That it's random text gives the game a surrealistic edge, but the random text giving a game a surrealistic edge, the text would have been written by somebody. The system that makes the text pop up would have been deliberately put into the game in some way. So that's really curation, which is different to AI.
I just had a thought, actually, is that what Alan's describing reminds me a lot of auto-tune in the music industry, where I think about 20 years ago, when this technology came out, there was this big furor about artists using auto-tune and not using their real singing voices and things like that. And there were two kind of strains of music that developed from it. One is this pop music that we have now, where auto-tune is probably assumed, and people who are still quite talented use it, and they just make a more perfect product, versus artists who kind of manipulate auto-tune to get a more robotic sound that is its own new aesthetic thing that wouldn't have existed without the technology. I wonder if that's what the crossroads will be for AI as well, is that there's going to be people who just use it for the most basic of functions and save money. And there's also going to be people who find ways of breaking it and manipulating it to create things that otherwise couldn't be possible without the technology.
I mean, I've heard that argument before, but I do think that it's a little bit different with AI because, again, AI can't create anything new. It's absolutely incapable of doing so. All AI can do is aggregate existing information. It
But
might
it can make
look
arrangements of
different.
that information that haven't existed before, though.
It can do that, but ultimately, when you break that down, you're left with just pieces of existing work still. They might not be necessarily easy to distinguish to the naked eye or whatever, but underline that the actual creation process, not the end product, but the creation process is there is no creation process for AI. That's the difference. So, for example, to talk about that, I mentioned earlier the tweet about the kimono wearing girl. If you were to create a Yakuza game or a game set in traditional Japan and you needed a character wearing a kimono, if you were to do it the creative way, you would get an artist to go and research kimono and to talk to an expert on kimono and to use that information that they collect to create this character. And the result would be something that would be hopefully authentic and true and not just look good, but also be you an expression of the culture. Whereas with AI, there is no research, there is no creation process. It just collects existing information and then spits out something that the system, the algorithm, has been trained to think is what that costume is. And the chances are that it is going to be in some way inaccurate. It's not going to be reflective of the culture, and as a result, you may have something that looks good, but you've got something that has no meaning behind it. It
What if
doesn't.
it's trained like wrong on purpose, and then that leads to the creation of something unique and breaking of what AI is to create like a surreal experience?
But that's another thing, and that Dylan put out a tweet about how surreal AI can be as well, because he had the AI generator and a piano that had an elephant mixed in or something. Like you can go and find the tweet; it's still out there. But and he was like, "Oh, this is so surreal." Surrealism had a lot of thought behind it. It was an art movement that a whole bunch of artists actually very specifically thought about what they were doing. They were deliberately, breaking a lot of artistic conventions down, and they were deliberately criticizing a lot of things that they thought was wrong with the art world, with the work that they were doing. There was a lot of thinking behind surrealism. Surrealism was not just random stuff for the sake of having random stuff thrown together. And there was a thought process there in the creation of surrealist art. There was a thought process, but AI doesn't have that thought process. It just throws random things together. So you might point at it and say, "Hey, look, how surrealist is this?" But it's not surrealist. It is just random. There are very different things. There is a depth of thought that goes into art, making any kind of art, whether that is a single line of dialogue from an NPC in the middle of a Ubisoft game, or a main character in their costume. There is a lot of thought that goes into these things that AI cannot do. And if we're going to rely on AI to do those things, we are going to immediately make the video games that are created be that much shallower, that much lacking of thought, that all it matters to the developer is that there's content in the game, that it looks good, but not what that content means. And that, I mean, we've talked about all those things in the games in previous podcasts, but that is just an acceleration of a lot of the problems. Yeah, I really am very concerned about this. Video games already had a problem that too much of the video game industry is just a whole bunch of stupid shit that's thrown in for the sake of content. That this is going to like superpower that. It's going to make the games just so shallow.
When you're talking about that kimono example, my first thought was, yes, a human being could research and could make something authentic and culturally meaningful, or they could just make Ghost of Tsushima, right? Like it already exists. People are already doing that.
I have huge issues with Ghost of Tsushima, but in all respect to the developers, they still went to Tsushima as part of their research. They still talked to people in the production of their game. I don't think they got there, but they still went through the process of trying to, do things with it, to think about what they were doing. There was a thought process in the creation of that game that meant that there was effort there. AI is a no effort thing, and you can say, sure, humans might curate the results of AI, and there might be a human behind the production of AI, making sure that the characters get signed off, or the dialogue is legible before they actually put it into the game or whatever. But the actual creation of all these things has no thought go into it. It's just, it's the assumption that all the world's information that's on the internet, all the world's information is somehow equivalent to doing your own thought process. And it's just not. I think AI has a lot of applications in a lot of things. We've seen examples of, for example, people getting away with speeding tickets or parking fines, one or the other, I can't remember which, by getting AI to write their letter to the police, their response letter. or there was an example of a law firm that used AI to help with a court case or whatever. There is a lot of applications of AI that I do think is valuable. But one thing I do not see AI having any valuable input into is any kind of creative process. So the more that game developers cede the creative process to AI, the less intelligent, less interesting, and less thoughtful our games are going to be.
Yeah, but also again, we've got Far Cry 6, which is offensive to me.
Mind
Fun
you,
game to
I was
play.
going to say I'm deeply unsurprised that Ubisoft would be the first one to jump onto this
Yeah.
shit, because Ubisoft is just, I mean, they were already making stupid games that had no point anyway. So, yay, Ubisoft, continue doing what you're doing.
They're just making it easier for their teams to.
It pisses me
give
off because I just gave
workplace.
Ubisoft a good review this week. Now I feel bad for doing that. Fuckers.
Anno, let's go.
Anno was good. Anno's good. Good on
Yeah.
Ubisoft actually creating a game that's worth playing. But I wish I didn't have to give Ubisoft a good review. They don't deserve it.